Marcus Jenkins was an unassuming man, despite being the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the city. He had built the company from the ground up, starting with nothing but an idea and a passion to change the world. Over the years, he had grown into a figure of power and influence, surrounded by wealth, luxury, and respect. But for all the success, there was a growing sense of unease that lingered in his mind like an uninvited guest. Something was off in the company he had created, and he couldn't put his finger on it. He spent most of his days in high-level meetings, working with investors and negotiating deals, but there were moments when he'd catch himself staring at the faces of the people who worked beneath him, the janitors, the technicians, the security guards, and he would wonder if they were happy. Did they feel valued? Or had they been reduced to cogs in the machine, grinding away while the executives reaped the rewards? The day it all started to unravel was like any other. Marcus had just wrapped up a meeting with his senior team, discussing projections for the next quarter. His assistant, Elena, had given him a rundown of the company's most recent survey results, which included feedback from the employees at all levels. Most of it was routine, a few complaints about work hours, some suggestions for improving the cafeteria, the usual grumbling that came with any corporate environment. But one section of the survey stood out to Marcus. It was the part where employees had anonymously shared their thoughts on the company's leadership. As he skimmed through the responses, his stomach tightened. There was a growing sense of dissatisfaction among the staff, particularly those working in lower-level positions. "They don't feel heard," Marcus muttered, scanning one response after another. "They think we're out of touch." Elena, standing by his side, nodded. "It's not just a few people either. I've seen this kind of sentiment grow over the past year. The workers feel like they're being taken for granted." Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. It wasn't that he hadn't known that the company had its issues. No company was perfect, and as it grew, so did the complexities. But hearing it laid out so starkly, seeing the reality of it in black and white, was like a punch to the gut. He had always prided himself on being a fair and compassionate leader, but now he realized how far removed he had become from the day-to-day lives of his employees. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the problem wasn't just the dissatisfaction of a few disgruntled workers. It was deeper than that. It was systemic. It was about the widening gap between the executives at the top and the employees at the bottom. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, the thoughts swirled in his mind, growing louder and louder, like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop. He had been so focused on the big picture, the deals, the mergers, the investors, that he had failed to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. It wasn't enough to sit in boardrooms and sign checks. If he wanted to make the company truly great, he needed to understand what was happening on the ground level. He needed to see the company through the eyes of the people who actually kept it running. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a resolve that surprised even him. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He had to find out for himself what was really going on in the company. The only way to do that was to go undercover. He knew it wouldn't be easy. After all, he was the CEO, Marcus Jenkins, the man everyone in the company knew and respected. If he were to show up at a worksite, everyone would know who he was. But that wasn't going to stop him. He had a plan. He would disguise himself as one of the janitors. A simple uniform, a mop, and a name tag that didn't belong to him. He would blend in, work the long hours, and observe the company from a perspective that no one could see coming. Only then would he truly understand the culture of his company. Only then would he be able to make the changes that were so desperately needed. Marcus spent the next few days preparing. He researched what it meant to be a janitor, reading up on the responsibilities and tasks that came with the job. He wanted to immerse himself fully in the experience, no shortcuts. He ordered a janitor's uniform online, complete with a cap and name tag. He even studied the routes the janitors took while cleaning to ensure that he could avoid detection. He knew that even the slightest mistake could reveal his true identity. Finally, the day came. Marcus was ready. He arrived at the company's headquarters early in the morning, long before the employees started their workday. The building was empty, quiet, except for the janitors who were already there, sweeping the floors and emptying the trash. Marcus slipped into the janitor's uniform and walked to the back entrance, trying to keep a low profile. His heart raced as he approached the cleaning crew. He had done everything to prepare for this moment, but there was still a knot in his stomach. What would it be like to work alongside these people? How would they treat him? How would he be able to blend in without raising suspicion? "Hey there, you're new?" one of the janitors, a man named Tony, asked as he looked up from his mop. "Yeah," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice as neutral as possible. "Just started today." Tony nodded and smiled. "Welcome aboard. We keep it pretty laid back around here. You'll get the hang of it." As the day went on, Marcus fell into a rhythm, working alongside Tony and the others. The work was physically demanding, but not particularly difficult. He was struck by how much the janitors had to do, how many hours they spent maintaining the building, often without much recognition. He could see the fatigue in their eyes, the way they moved quickly but never seemed to catch a break. It wasn't that the janitors didn't enjoy their work, it was that they didn't seem to be treated with the respect they deserved. They were invisible, unnoticed by the higher-ups who rarely ventured into the building outside of their luxurious offices. It wasn't long before Marcus realized that his suspicions about the company's culture were more than justified. Conversations among employees revealed a disheartening truth: many felt overlooked, underappreciated, and sometimes even mistreated by the management. There were stories of employees being forced to work long hours without adequate pay, of promises being broken, and of favoritism in promotions. As he mopped the floors and emptied the trash, Marcus listened closely to the conversations that unfolded. The complaints were constant, and they painted a picture of a company that had lost its soul. That night, after finishing his shift, Marcus sat alone in the janitor's closet, reflecting on what he had learned. The truth was clearer now than ever before. His company, the company he had built with his own hands, was in trouble. It wasn't just the financial issues he had been aware of, it was the entire culture. The gap between the executives and the employees had grown so wide that it was becoming impossible to bridge. And the worst part? The people at the top had no idea what was happening in the trenches. The workers who were keeping the company running were being exploited, left behind, forgotten. Marcus knew that he had to do something about it. But what? He couldn't just reveal his identity and expect things to change. If he exposed himself too soon, the trust he had gained from the janitors and employees would vanish in an instant. He needed to get to the heart of the issue, understand why things had gotten so bad, and then make a decision that would affect not just his future but the future of the entire company. The next day, as he arrived for his second shift, Marcus knew that this mission was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. And with every passing hour, he was getting closer to uncovering something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. But what he didn't know was that the truth he was seeking might be more than he could handle. The following days were a blur for Marcus. Each shift he worked, each floor he mopped, each trash can he emptied, brought him closer to the unsettling truth he had begun to suspect. The work was exhausting, far from glamorous, and often thankless. But that wasn't the hardest part. No, the hardest part was observing how the janitors, the maintenance workers, and the other lower-level employees were treated. They were the invisible backbone of the company, yet their presence seemed to be nothing more than an afterthought to those in power. The higher-ups walked around the building with a sense of entitlement, oblivious to the people who were literally keeping the lights on. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that bothered Marcus, it was the emotional toll of watching his employees work tirelessly while being dismissed, ignored, or worse, treated with disdain. Every conversation he overheard in the break room, every grunt of frustration he heard in the hallway, felt like a personal indictment. The janitors, men and women, young and old, did their jobs with little fanfare, but there was a noticeable fatigue in their voices. They never complained outright, but the tiredness in their eyes spoke volumes. Tony, the janitor who had welcomed Marcus on his first day, had become a silent companion during the long shifts. He often shared stories about the job, the long hours, and the way the company had changed over the years. Tony spoke of a time when things had been different, when employees were treated with respect and dignity, no matter their position. But those days seemed long gone. Now, it felt as if the company had forgotten its roots, lost in the pursuit of profit and expansion. "There's no love in this place anymore," Tony muttered one evening as they swept the floors together. "Used to be, the boss would stop by, check in on us. Not anymore. It's like we don't even exist unless something goes wrong." Marcus didn't know how to respond. The words hit him hard, and for a moment, he found himself unable to speak. He wanted to tell Tony that things could be different, that he could make it right, but how could he? As CEO, he had been the one driving the company's growth, focusing on profits and shareholders. In his blind ambition, he had lost sight of the very people who had helped him get there in the first place. The realization gnawed at him, but he couldn't allow himself to dwell on it. Not yet. There was still more to uncover. Over the next few shifts, Marcus began to witness things that made him increasingly uncomfortable. He overheard conversations in the break room that spoke of systemic issues within the company, grievances about unpaid overtime, employees being passed over for promotions because of favoritism, and management turning a blind eye to workers' needs. It wasn't just the janitors who were frustrated, there was a growing unrest among the lower-level employees across the company. Some of the technicians had been working the same shifts for years without any recognition, while others spoke bitterly about their inability to move up in the company, despite their years of service. The morale of the staff was at an all-time low. Marcus began to realize that the problems in his company were far deeper than he had initially thought. It wasn't just a matter of fixing one or two issues, this was a cultural problem that had been festering for years. One evening, as Marcus was cleaning a hallway near the executive offices, he overheard a conversation that would change everything. The voices were coming from a nearby conference room, and as he passed by, he caught snippets of a heated discussion. The door was slightly ajar, and Marcus, ever the curious observer, couldn't help but listen. He recognized the voices immediately, two of his senior executives, Claire and Stephen. They were discussing company performance, but what made Marcus freeze in his tracks was the tone of the conversation. "It's not about fairness, Claire," Stephen said, his voice laced with irritation. "It's about making the numbers. The workers don't matter. They're expendable. We just need them to do their job and keep their mouths shut. If they don't like it, there's a line of people waiting to take their place." Marcus's blood ran cold. He had heard rumors of ruthless business practices in other companies, but he never imagined it would be happening right under his nose. Claire responded with a sharp, cynical laugh. "Exactly. It's not about people. It's about profits. If we have to cut a few corners, so be it. We've got to keep our shareholders happy." The words hit Marcus like a slap in the face. He had worked with these people for years, trusted them to share his vision and values. But now, hearing their true thoughts, he realized how misguided he had been. The people he had surrounded himself with weren't the ones who shared his dream of creating a company that cared about its employees. They were cold, calculating, and more focused on the bottom line than the well-being of the very people who made the company successful. Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. For a moment, he considered confronting them, storming into the room and demanding answers. But he stopped himself. He had to stay undercover. If they knew who he was, the whole point of his mission would be lost. He needed to gather more information, to see just how deep this toxic culture went. As the days passed, Marcus continued his routine, working side by side with the janitors, technicians, and maintenance staff. He saw how their morale was steadily declining. Many of them had worked at the company for years, dedicating their time and energy to the job, only to be treated like they were invisible. Marcus knew he had to act quickly. The company needed a change, a complete overhaul. But how could he bring that about? He couldn't just march into the boardroom and demand everyone to be fired. No, it was more complicated than that. He had to find a way to inspire change, to show the executives what they were blind to. The turning point came one evening when Marcus was finishing his shift. He was in the lobby, pushing a cart of supplies, when he overheard a conversation that made his blood boil. It was a conversation between two junior executives who didn't know he was listening. "I heard we're laying off a bunch of people next quarter," one of them said. "It's just part of the plan. You know how it goes. Streamline operations, save money." "Yeah," the other replied. "And the janitors? They're easy targets. Who'll notice if we cut back on cleaning staff? They're just janitors, right?" Marcus couldn't stand it any longer. He dropped his cleaning supplies and stepped out of the shadows, walking directly toward the two executives. They looked up, startled, their faces draining of color when they realized who he was. "I'm not a janitor," Marcus said coldly. "But you'll regret treating them like they are." The two executives stammered, trying to backpedal, but Marcus could see the guilt in their eyes. They knew they had been caught. But it wasn't enough to just call them out, he needed to act. He knew that if he wanted to change the culture, he had to start with the people at the top. The next morning, Marcus called a meeting with the board members. As he sat in the conference room, the weight of the situation finally hit him. He had uncovered the truth: the company he had built was rotten at its core, and it was up to him to make things right. But it wasn't going to be easy. The executives had to be held accountable for their actions, and the culture had to be completely reformed. The workers needed to feel valued again, to know that they mattered. Marcus was no longer the man who walked into boardrooms and signed deals. He was a man on a mission to reclaim the company's soul, and he was willing to do whatever it took. But as he prepared to make his case, something unexpected happened. The phone rang. It was Elena, his assistant. "The board's been meeting about the layoffs," she said, her voice trembling. "They're already preparing the announcement." The clock was ticking. The final pieces were falling into place, but would Marcus be able to act in time to stop the corporate machine from destroying everything he had worked for? He didn't know yet, but one thing was certain: nothing was ever going to be the same again. Marcus sat at his desk late that night, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The board meeting was scheduled for tomorrow, and he knew that it was his moment, his one opportunity to set things right. His mind raced through the possibilities of how it could go. What if they dismissed him? What if his efforts to confront the board would be in vain? But then again, what was the alternative? Allowing the status quo to continue? Allowing his employees to suffer and be exploited? He couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Tony, the janitor who had become his unlikely confidant. "Some of us are hearing rumors. Is it true about the layoffs? They say it's going to be bad this time." Marcus felt a pang of guilt shoot through him. Tony had been working for the company for nearly 2 decades. He had seen the company grow, seen how things had changed for the worse, but through it all, he remained. Now, it seemed like Tony and his fellow janitors were at risk of losing everything. How could he let that happen? He quickly typed back. "I'll fix it. I promise. I'm working on it." The words felt hollow, but it was the best he could do for now. He put his phone down, staring at the pile of papers and reports in front of him. The numbers were grim, but the real problem wasn't the numbers themselves, it was the culture behind them. The relentless pursuit of profit over people had created a toxic environment, and no amount of cost-cutting or financial wizardry was going to change that. If Marcus wanted to save the company, he would have to confront its very soul. He thought back to the conversation he had overheard between Claire and Stephen, the two senior executives. Their cold, detached attitude toward the employees was exactly what had brought the company to this point. It wasn't enough to just get rid of the people at the top. No, Marcus realized that the entire structure needed to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. The only way to fix the company was to restore the trust and dignity that had been stripped away from its employees. It was a daunting task, but Marcus knew that he couldn't turn back now. He had already uncovered the truth, and now it was time to face it head-on. He had spent years building this company, but now he had to save it, not just from financial ruin, but from the kind of corporate culture that had poisoned everything it touched. The next morning, Marcus walked into the boardroom with a calm determination. He had already made up his mind, there would be no compromises. He had to confront the board and hold them accountable for their actions. The fate of the company, and its employees, rested on his shoulders. The room was filled with tense silence as the board members took their seats. They all knew the stakes. Today would be a turning point for the company, and they could feel it. Marcus cleared his throat, standing at the head of the table. He had always been a charismatic leader, someone who could easily command attention, but today was different. Today, he was no longer just the CEO. Today, he was a man on a mission, and he wasn't going to back down. I know you're all aware of the layoffs that are being planned, he began, his voice steady but laced with underlying anger. I've heard the rumors, and I've seen the reports. But I want you to know that I won't stand by and let this happen. These are real people we're talking about, people who have dedicated years of their lives to this company. And we're talking about cutting them loose like they're nothing. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Claire, the CFO, spoke up first, her tone sharp and defensive. Marcus, we understand your concerns, but you need to look at the big picture. The company's financial health is at risk. These cuts are necessary to keep the business afloat. Marcus shook his head, his frustration rising. It's not about the numbers. It's about the people. These people, the ones you're planning to lay off, are the backbone of this company. Without them, there is no company. The janitors, the maintenance workers, the technicians, they are all integral to our success. You can't just reduce them to numbers on a spreadsheet. Claire's eyes narrowed. And what do you suggest we do, Marcus? We're trying to save this company. If we don't make these cuts, the entire business could collapse. Marcus could feel his blood boiling. He had heard these arguments before, the cold logic of profit above all else. But he had seen firsthand the consequences of that kind of thinking. It was a culture of exploitation, and it was unsustainable. I'm not suggesting that we ignore the financial realities, he said, his voice firm but calm. But we need to find a solution that works for everyone. We need to invest in our people, not throw them away. If we want this company to thrive, we need to change the way we operate. We need to restore the respect and dignity that's been lost. The room fell silent. The board members looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. Marcus could feel the weight of their skepticism. They had built their careers on the pursuit of profits, and now he was asking them to fundamentally rethink their approach. It was a tough sell, but Marcus wasn't backing down. We're in this together, Marcus continued, his voice growing more impassioned. We built this company from the ground up, and we did it by caring about our people. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. But I'm not giving up on them. I'm not giving up on this company. And I'm not giving up on the values that got us here in the first place. The tension in the room was palpable, but Marcus could sense a shift. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the recognition that he might be right. It was the first sign of hope he had seen in days. Let me be clear, Marcus added, leaning forward. If we go forward with these layoffs, I will resign. I will walk away from this company, and I will ensure that everyone knows the real reason why. I won't be a part of a company that treats its employees like disposable commodities. There was a stunned silence as the weight of his words settled in. The board members exchanged looks, and for the first time, Marcus could see a flicker of concern in their eyes. They were realizing that their vision for the company was no longer sustainable. The very people who had helped them build their empire were now being left behind, and Marcus wasn't willing to let that happen. After what felt like an eternity, Claire spoke, her voice softer now, more contemplative. We need to reconsider our approach, she said, her tone more measured. But we can't ignore the financial pressures. Marcus nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. I know. But we have to do better. We have to find a way to make this work for everyone. The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. There were no promises, no guarantees, but Marcus could tell that the board was beginning to understand. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. The fight was far from over, but Marcus knew one thing for sure: he had started the process of change. The company was at a crossroads, and Marcus was determined to guide it in the right direction. He wouldn't stop until the employees, the heart of the company, were treated with the respect they deserved. As he left the boardroom, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step in the right direction. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a leader, fighting for the people who had made his success possible. And that night, as Marcus drove home, he thought about Tony and the other workers who had inspired him to take action. The road ahead. The days following the board meeting were tense. Marcus had made his stand, but the future of the company was still uncertain. He knew that the board's reluctant concession was only the beginning. They had agreed to reconsider the layoffs, but only after intense scrutiny, which meant that it wasn't over yet. The battle had just shifted to a new front, convincing the entire company, from the highest executives down to the janitors, that change was possible. As the days passed, Marcus continued his work undercover, visiting different departments and talking to employees who were still unaware of his true identity. He spent long hours in the back offices, in the maintenance halls, and even in the cafeteria, listening to the complaints, the whispers, and the quiet hope that things could be different. His disguise as a janitor had turned into a powerful tool, not just for gathering information, but for truly understanding the pulse of his company. It wasn't just the janitors who were worried. It was everyone. The staff members in human resources, the marketing team, the engineers who developed the product. It was clear that the deep-seated anxiety was widespread. People were afraid of losing their livelihoods, and in many cases, they had already started looking for new jobs, unsure of how much longer they could endure the uncertainty. Marcus knew that something had to change. The company's culture was toxic, driven by fear and the relentless push for profits. But he couldn't just impose a new vision from the top down, it had to come from within, from the ground up. One afternoon, as he was pushing a cleaning cart down the hallway, Marcus overheard a conversation that shook him to his core. He was in a quiet corner of the building, where the CEO's office and the executive suites were located. The door to a conference room was slightly ajar, and he could hear Claire's voice. She was speaking to Stephen, her counterpart on the board, and what they were discussing made Marcus' blood run cold. "You know we have to pull the trigger soon," Claire was saying. "If we don't, the shareholders will start asking questions, and we can't afford to have them doubt us. We've already pushed the limits this year." Marcus stood frozen behind the door, trying to keep his breathing as silent as possible. He had to hear everything. "The employees are going to hate it, but they don't understand the stakes," Stephen replied, his voice matter of fact. "We're doing this to keep the company alive. We've been taking risks for years, but if we don't make these cuts, we're toast." Marcus' stomach churned. The cold, clinical attitude toward the people who made the company run, the people who had poured their sweat and blood into the job, was unbearable. They saw employees as numbers, nothing more. He realized that his suspicion had been right all along. The decisions that had been made behind closed doors were not just about financial survival, they were about maintaining control and power at any cost. But they've been loyal. Some of these people have worked here for decades, Claire protested, her voice softening slightly. How do we just throw them out like trash? Loyalty doesn't pay the bills, Stephen snapped. It's harsh, but we have to make the hard choices. This isn't about feelings, it's about survival. Marcus felt his heart pound in his chest. The betrayal was clear. The people he had thought were on his side, the ones he had hoped would share his vision for a better company, were just as corrupted by the same mindset that had brought them to this point. They cared more about their own survival than the well-being of the workers who had made the company what it was. His blood boiled with rage, but as he heard the door creak slightly, he quickly ducked behind the nearest trash bin. He didn't want them to know he had overheard. The conversation continued as Claire and Stephen discussed the specifics of the layoffs, as well as some of the legal hurdles they'd have to clear to ensure they could do it without too much public backlash. It was a cold, calculating discussion, and Marcus realized he couldn't allow this to happen. These decisions, made in the name of profit and corporate survival, would destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. The culture of the company, its heart and soul, was in danger of being torn apart by a few decisions made in a sterile, corporate boardroom. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, he couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He had heard what he needed to hear, but now he had to decide what to do with that information. He had already committed to change, to confronting the board and steering the company back toward its original values. But hearing the cold-hearted way the layoffs were being handled made him question if he was ready to take that final step. He couldn't allow Claire and Stephen to continue leading the company down this path. They had lost sight of the bigger picture. They had lost sight of the people. But Marcus knew that taking them on directly in a board meeting wouldn't be enough. He needed something more. Something that would expose the true nature of the leadership to the rest of the company. He needed a way to unite the employees, to rally them to his side, to show them that they had a future, if they were willing to fight for it. The idea struck him like a bolt of lightning. He had to give the employees a voice, and he had to do it in a way that would show Claire, Stephen, and the rest of the board that their time was up. The next morning, Marcus gathered a small group of key employees in a backroom. These were the people who were trusted by their peers, the ones who had shown integrity and loyalty even when times were tough. Some of them had already been secretly helping Marcus with his plans, offering support and sharing their concerns about the company's future. Marcus knew that this was the group that could help him make the change he wanted to see. "We need to take action," Marcus said, looking around at the group. "We're not just going to sit back and let this happen. I've heard everything. I know the plans they're making, and I can't let that go down without a fight." The employees nodded, some with determination, others with visible anxiety. Marcus knew it wouldn't be easy, but the only way to confront the board and Claire and Stephen was to rally the company together, to show them the strength of their collective power. "It's time we take control of our future," he continued. "We can do this, but we have to be united. We have to be loud, and we have to be strategic." The group worked through the details, discussing how to approach the rest of the company. They began to formulate a plan to expose the truth to everyone, to let the employees know the real stakes of what was happening. They would organize a company-wide meeting, and Marcus would speak to everyone, telling them exactly what had been said behind closed doors and how their future was being decided without their input. The risk was enormous. If it failed, Marcus would lose everything: his career, his reputation, and most importantly, the trust of the employees he had worked so hard to gain. But the stakes were too high. He couldn't let the company fall into the hands of those who only saw people as expendable commodities. The day of the meeting arrived, and Marcus stood in front of the assembled employees. He could feel the tension in the room, the uncertainty. But as he spoke, something changed. They began to listen. They began to understand what was at stake. "The truth is, we've been at a crossroads for a long time," Marcus began. "And it's time for us to choose which path we want to take. We can keep going down the road of cutting costs and making decisions that hurt our people, or we can rebuild this company with a foundation of respect, trust, and integrity." He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd. "This isn't just about saving jobs. This is about saving our company. It's about saving our culture. We've got to fight for what we believe in, and we've got to do it together." The room was silent at first. But then, slowly, a few voices began to speak up, and soon the room was filled with support. The employees rallied behind him, and together, they began to lay the groundwork for a new future. Marcus could feel the tide turning. He had made his stand, and now, the company was ready to follow him into a new era. In the days that followed the meeting, Marcus could feel the momentum shifting. What had started as a quiet rebellion, a lone executive trying to make a difference, was now turning into a collective force. Employees who had once been too afraid to speak up, too fearful of losing their jobs, were now emboldened. They stood together, united in their desire for change. The whispers of discontent had grown into loud voices calling for a better future, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The once apathetic workforce was awakening to the possibility of a company that truly valued them, not as expendable assets, but as the heart and soul of its operations. But as the energy grew stronger within the company, so did the resistance from the top. Claire and Stephen, the two board members Marcus had overheard in the hallway, were not going to let go of their vision for the company so easily. Behind closed doors, they worked tirelessly to undermine Marcus's efforts. They questioned his authority, dismissed his actions as naive, and labeled him a threat to their carefully laid plans. Marcus knew that they would stop at nothing to maintain control and to push through the cuts that would ultimately secure their positions, even if it meant destroying the morale of the workforce in the process. The tension reached a breaking point when Marcus was called to another emergency board meeting. He entered the large, glass-walled conference room, his heart pounding. Claire and Stephen sat at opposite ends of the table, their faces stern, almost cold. The other board members, many of whom had remained silent during the previous discussions, now eyed him warily. They had all heard the murmurs from the employees, the complaints, the frustration, and the cries for help. They had seen the emails, the petitions, the internal complaints about the company's direction. They had seen the pushback. "We need to address this," Claire said, her voice clipped. "You've stirred up the workforce, Marcus. And now they're making demands. They're asking for things that we cannot afford." Marcus leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "What they're asking for is basic dignity. They want transparency. They want to feel like they matter, like they're not just numbers in a spreadsheet. But the real battle was just beginning." "Want respect?" Stephen scoffed. "Respect? This is a business, not a charity. We can't just throw away years of careful planning because of some idealistic notion of employee morale. These cuts need to happen, Marcus. It's not a choice." Marcus' frustration bubbled to the surface, but he kept his tone even. "This isn't about idealism. It's about survival, yes, but not just the survival of the bottom line. We're talking about the survival of the company's soul. If we lose the trust of our employees, we lose everything. Without them, there is no company." Claire's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, another board member, Greg, spoke up. His voice was quieter than the others, but there was a determination behind it. "I've been talking to a few of the department heads, and it's clear that the situation is more complicated than we thought. The employees are feeling betrayed, and morale is at an all-time low. If we don't change course soon, we might lose some of our most talented people. We can't afford that. Marcus felt a spark of hope. Finally, someone else was speaking his language. Thank you, Greg. That's exactly it. We have a chance here to do something different, something better for the long-term health of the company. We can't sacrifice our people for short-term profits. The investors might not like it, but they'll respect us in the end for doing the right thing. Stephen sneered. The right thing? You're speaking as though we have a luxury of time. Our investors won't wait for us to figure out some idealistic dream of corporate kindness. We need results now, Marcus. You're losing touch with what's at stake. I haven't lost touch, Marcus shot back, his voice growing stronger. I've just come to realize that the true results come from building a culture that respects and values its people. That's the foundation we need to rebuild. The room was silent for a moment. Marcus could see that the others were listening, but he also saw the resistance in Claire and Stephen's eyes. They were not going to let go without a fight. He knew they wouldn't just accept his argument, it was going to take more than words to change their minds. But Marcus wasn't ready to back down. He had already risked so much, and he wasn't going to let them win. Over the following weeks, Marcus stepped up his efforts. He met with department heads, line managers, and team leaders to discuss the changes he envisioned. He worked with employees to create new channels for communication, so they could directly voice their concerns and suggestions without fear of retribution. He made sure that those who had supported him in his undercover days were recognized, their efforts honored, their voices amplified. He worked to rebuild trust in the company, not just by making promises, but by taking concrete steps to show that the company would be different, more inclusive, more transparent, more committed to the well-being of its workers. But just as Marcus thought things were beginning to change, disaster struck. The company's largest investor, a powerful hedge fund, got wind of the unrest. The fund had always been focused on profits, and now it saw the employees' growing rebellion as a threat to its return on investment. Marcus received a call from his lawyer late one night, informing him that the hedge fund was threatening to pull out of their deal if Marcus didn't step down and allow the layoffs to proceed as planned. The pressure was immense. His vision for the company, his fight for fairness and respect, was on the verge of unraveling. In that moment, Marcus was faced with the hardest decision of his career. He could continue to fight, but doing so would mean risking everything, his career, his reputation, and the company itself. Or he could step aside, concede to the investors' demands, and save the company, but at the cost of betraying the very people who had stood by him. It was a decision that could change everything. He paced the floor of his office, trying to think it through. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had always believed that leadership was about standing firm in the face of adversity, but was it worth sacrificing everything for a cause? Would the company even survive if he took this stand? Was it better to make peace with the investors and go back to business as usual, or was it worth risking it all for the people who had trusted him? The next morning, Marcus walked into the boardroom, his decision made. As he stood before the board members, he could feel the tension in the room. Claire and Stephen were both present, their faces unreadable, but their postures told him everything he needed to know. This was it, the moment of truth. Marcus wasn't just making a decision about the company, he was making a decision about the future. His future. The future of everyone who depended on this company. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice steady but resolute, I've thought long and hard about what's best for the future of this company. And I've come to the conclusion that we need to choose a different path, one that's not about cutting jobs or pleasing investors, but one that's about building a future together. I will not back down from that vision. He paused, letting his words sink in. If that means parting ways with some of you, then so be it. But I believe in this company. I believe in the people who work here. And I won't abandon them. The room was silent. Then, slowly, one by one, board members began to speak up. Some were angry, others were surprised, but one thing was clear: Marcus had made his stand. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were no guarantees. But he had made a decision that would forever change the course of the company. The days that followed Marcus's declaration were nothing short of turbulent. The boardroom battles intensified, and the pressure from investors only grew heavier. Despite the resistance, Marcus felt a quiet, unshakable determination within himself. He knew that the path ahead was filled with uncertainty, but he believed in the core of his decision. He had chosen to fight not just for the future of the company, but for the people who had trusted him and believed in his vision. The media caught wind of the story. News outlets were quick to cover the unusual power struggle unfolding at the company, spinning the tale of a CEO who had gone undercover to witness the struggles of his employees, only to be faced with the harsh reality of corporate greed and investor pressure. The coverage was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it amplified Marcus's message, gaining support from those who admired his courage. On the other, it drew the ire of investors and key stakeholders who were far more concerned with numbers than morality. Every day, Marcus found himself balancing the relentless pressure of the board and the growing support of the employees. He spent countless hours in meetings, listening to both sides, trying to find a way to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. It became increasingly clear to him that change couldn't happen overnight. The foundation of the company had been built on profit-first principles for so long that undoing that mentality required more than just lofty speeches. It needed action, commitment, and most of all, time. But Marcus was ready. He couldn't afford to wait. He had already made the decision to stake his future on the fight for a more humane and transparent company culture. One evening, as he sat in his office, surrounded by a mountain of reports and documents, Marcus received an unexpected call from Greg, the board member who had supported him early on. Greg's voice on the other end of the line was tight with urgency. "Marcus, you need to be careful. The pressure from the hedge fund is mounting. They're not just threatening to pull their investment, they're pulling every trick in the book to undermine you. If you don't play ball, you could lose everything. The company, your career, everything you've worked for." Marcus felt his heart race, but he steadied himself. He had come too far to back down now. "Greg, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not going to give in. This company can survive without the hedge fund. We can build a future on our own terms. I won't let anyone bully me into sacrificing the employees who've put their trust in me." Greg sighed deeply. "I understand where you're coming from. But you're not just fighting for the employees anymore. You're fighting for the future of the company. Do you really think it can survive this kind of resistance? You're facing forces bigger than you, bigger than any of us." Marcus's mind flashed back to the moment he had overheard Claire and Stephen's conversation, the chilling realization that the company had become a machine fueled by profits and disregard for the very people who made it run. He couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. The following week, Marcus faced the board again. It was another tense, high-stakes meeting, but this time, the room felt different. The employee support had grown exponentially, and Marcus's unwavering commitment to his vision had earned him a certain degree of respect, even among those who had been skeptical of his methods. Still, there was a palpable sense of discomfort in the air as the board members gathered around the table. The tension between them was nearly unbearable. Claire and Stephen remained steadfast in their opposition, their eyes narrow with disdain as they took their seats at the head of the table. "You're playing a dangerous game, Marcus," Claire said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, and now you want us to cater to every whim of your employees? This isn't about idealism, Marcus. This is about reality." Marcus stood at the front of the room, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. The time for diplomacy was over. He had tried reasoning, tried bargaining, but now it was time to make his final stand. "The reality, Claire, is that this company won't survive if we continue to treat people as expendable. We've built a culture that values profits above all else, and that's why we're in this mess. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can be profitable and humane at the same time. If that's a risk you're not willing to take, then I'm afraid we're at an impasse. There was a long pause, a moment of tense silence, before Stephen finally spoke up. You're a dreamer, Marcus. You think you can change the system, but you can't. Not when the world is run by people who care about one thing, money. You've been given a chance to lead, and you're throwing it all away. Marcus met his gaze unwaveringly. No, Stephen. I'm not throwing it all away. I'm building something new. Something that lasts. At that moment, something unexpected happened. One of the board members who had remained silent throughout the entire meeting, Greg, stood up. He looked around the room, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the others. I've been thinking a lot about what Marcus has said, he began, his voice calm but firm. And I think he's right. We've been so focused on the bottom line that we've forgotten what made this company great in the first place. We've forgotten the people who built it. If we don't start thinking differently, we'll lose everything, not just employees, but customers, investors, and our reputation. The other board members exchanged uncertain glances, their previous convictions wavering under the weight of Greg's words. Marcus knew that the tide was shifting, but the battle wasn't over yet. It wasn't just about convincing the board, it was about ensuring that the changes Marcus envisioned would take root in the company's culture and operations. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus was left with a profound sense of uncertainty. The board had agreed to a temporary ceasefire, but it was clear that the war was far from over. He had won this battle, but the future of the company remained uncertain. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus continued his efforts to reshape the company from the inside out. He worked closely with HR to implement new training programs focused on inclusivity, transparency, and collaboration. He partnered with the communications team to launch a new initiative that would allow employees to submit anonymous feedback, creating a safe space for them to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. He made sure that leadership was held accountable to the same standards as the rest of the company. But even as he fought to make meaningful changes, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was looming over the company, a force beyond his control, a reckoning that would test whether the company's new direction was truly sustainable. It came in the form of a meeting request from the hedge fund, the very same one that had threatened to pull its investment. The call was set for the following week, and Marcus knew that this would be the most critical moment of his career. The hedge fund had one goal: to maintain control. They would not let Marcus's vision for the company succeed without a fight. And Marcus knew that, no matter the outcome, this meeting would be the final test of whether his decision to stand up for his employees, and for his values, was the right one. As he sat down at the table with the hedge fund representatives, the gravity of the moment hit him harder than ever before. They had come to talk about the future of the company, but Marcus knew that this conversation would determine much more than that. It would decide whether he could ever truly change the corporate world.